October 14th, 1066. Somewhere on a hillside in Sussex, England, the world is about to change forever. You probably already know how this ends. A king falls, an arrow flies, a dynasty dies in a single afternoon. But here is the thing no one ever asks. What kind of man stands on a ridge knowing that everything, his kingdom, his family, his name, hangs on the next few hours? What kind of life leads a person to that exact ridge on that exact morning with that exact weight pressing down on his chest? Harold Godwinson did not blunder into history. He spent 40 years building toward a single crowning moment. And then he spent 9 months watching it all unravel. He defeated one invader and then turned south to face another, marching his exhausted army through autumn mud, sleeping 3 hours a night, driven by something that was equal parts courage and desperation. Was he a great king? Was he a usurper? Was he a man betrayed by his own ambition, or a man betrayed by the cruelties of fate? Those are questions we will answer today. But first, let us go to the hill. The morning of October 14th begins quietly. Harold's men have been on that ridge since before first light. They are tired. Some have not slept properly in 3 weeks. They have marched nearly 500 miles in the space of a month, north to meet one army, south to meet another. And now they stand on a slope of earth called Senlac Ridge, and they lock their shields together, and they wait. Below them, the Norman cavalry of Duke William of Normandy begins to gather. The tension is almost unbearable. And then it breaks. The battle lasts all day. Hour after grinding hour, Norman cavalry charge uphill into a wall of shields and spears. Archers loose arrows in arcing volleys. Men scream, men fall. The ground gets wet and dark. Harold's line holds. Hour after hour it holds. And then, somewhere in the fading light of the afternoon, Harold Godwinson, King of England, dies. The exact manner of his death has been argued about for nearly 1,000 years. An arrow in the eye, says one tradition. Hacked down by Norman knights, says another. The truth may be somewhere in between, or it may be something stranger still. What is not argued is the consequence. When Harold fell, England fell with him. The Anglo-Saxon world, centuries of culture, language, law, and identity, collapsed in an afternoon. A new ruling class arrived, speaking a different language, praying in a different way, building in a different style. The England that existed before October 14th, 1066, never came back. This is the story of the last man who tried to stop that from happening. This is the story of Harold Godwinson. To understand Harold, you first have to understand his father. Because Harold Godwinson did not simply appear from nowhere and seize a crown. He was the product of one of the most extraordinary political rises in all of English history. And that rise began with a man named Godwin, Earl of Wessex. Godwin's own origins are murky. His father was probably a minor lord named Wulfnoth, who controlled a small fleet in the waters off the Sussex coast and used it, depending on who you believe, for either legitimate commerce or outright piracy. Possibly both. The English Channel in the early 11th century was a lawless, dangerous place, and men who could command ships commanded power. What is clear is that Godwin was clever. Aggressively, relentlessly clever. He spotted the opportunity of his era, and he took it. The opportunity was this. England in the early 11th century was a kingdom caught between two worlds. The old Anglo-Saxon royal line, the House of Wessex, had ruled for generations. But the Danes had been raiding and settling in England for 200 years by this point. In 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard conquered England outright. His son Canute followed him to the throne in 1016. And for the next 20 years, England was ruled by a Danish king who was also king of Denmark and Norway. This created a world of bewildering political complexity. Old English families competed with Danish ones. Allegiances shifted. Men made and lost fortunes in the space of a single political season. Godwin threaded this needle perfectly. He served Canute loyally, made himself indispensable, and was rewarded with the earldom of Wessex, the most powerful noble title in all of England, sometime around 1020. He then solidified his position with a brilliant marriage. His wife, Geitha, was Danish. Her brother was Ulf Thorgilsson, a Danish earl who had married the sister of Canute himself. This made Godwin not just a powerful English lord, but a member of the extended family of the North Sea Empire's ruling dynasty. He had, in essence, placed himself at the intersection of every major power structure in Northern Europe. And then he started having children. Harold was born around 1022 or 1023, probably somewhere in the south of England. He was not the oldest son. His brother Sweyn came first, but from the beginning, Harold appears to have inherited his father's instinct for positioning himself correctly. The world he was born into was, to modernize, extraordinarily violent and unstable. But it was also deeply interconnected. The North Sea in Harold's youth was not a barrier between nations, it was a highway. Vikings had settled in Ireland, in Normandy, in the eastern Baltic, in what is now Russia. The grandchildren of Norse raiders spoke English, French, Russian, and Gaelic, depending on where they had ended up. Political marriages stitched these communities together into a web of obligation and loyalty that stretched from Dublin to Kievan Rus. Harold grew up at the center of this web. He also grew up watching his father exercise power in a way that few English earls ever had. Canute died in 1035, and the succession to the English throne became contested. Godwin backed the right candidate, Harthacnut, Canute's son by his royal wife Emma, and when Harthacnut finally took the throne in 1040, Godwin's position was unassailable. Then came the move that would define the Godwin family's future forever. In 1042, the old House of Wessex returned to the English throne in the form of Edward, the son of the long-dead Anglo-Saxon king Athelred. Edward had spent his childhood in exile in Normandy, and he was, by most accounts, a genuinely pious and genuinely baffled man who found himself placed on the throne of England largely because Godwin had arranged it. His lack of domestic political base made him dependent on the family that had sponsored his return. Godwin cemented this dependency in the most direct way possible. He married his daughter, Edith, to the new king. His daughter became Queen of England. His eldest surviving son would eventually become Earl of East Anglia. His other sons would be given earldoms across the country. Within a decade, the Godwin family controlled more land, more wealth, and more political power than the king they theoretically served. By the mid-1040s, King Edward the Confessor had annual income from his lands of roughly £2,500. Godwin's family estates generated over £8,500 a year. The King of England was, by any practical measure, the second most powerful man in his own kingdom. This is the world Harold Godwinson grew up in. A world where his family was everything, where power was the oxygen his household breathed, and where the only direction available was forward. The only question was whether he had the talent to match the ambition. He did. Before we follow Harold into the heart of the story, we need to understand what England actually looked like in the 1040s and 1050s. Forget the image of a primitive medieval backwater. England in this period was, by the standards of the time, a sophisticated and wealthy kingdom. It had one of the most advanced administrative systems in Europe. It had a national tax system, the Geld, that could raise money from almost every corner of the country. It had a network of fortified towns called burhs that Alfred the Great had built 200 years earlier. It had a legal tradition that was ancient, complex, and fiercely defended. It was also a kingdom built on compromise. The Danish settlements in the north and east of England, a region so thoroughly Scandinavian in culture that it was known as the Danelaw, had their own customs, their own laws, their own political identity. The great northern earls were almost petty kings in their own right. The tension between the English south and the Scandinavian north was permanent, simmering, never fully resolved. And into this already complicated picture, you have to add Normandy. Normandy, the region of northern France that takes its name from the Northmen, the Vikings who settled it in the early 10th century, was by the mid-11th century a very different place from the Scandinavian world it had come from. The Norman dukes had adopted the French language, the Catholic Church's political structures, a form of heavily militarized castle-based feudalism that was transforming warfare across Europe. They were ambitious, organized, and they had a connection to England that they were increasingly inclined to use. Edward the Confessor had grown up among them. He trusted Normans. He appointed Normans to positions in the English church. He spoke French as his first language. This enraged the English nobility, and it enraged Godwin most of all. The tension between Godwin's English power base and Edward's Norman sympathies was the defining political fault line of the reign, and Harold grew up learning how to navigate it. He also grew up learning something more personal. His brother Sweyn was showing everyone what happened when you let ambition outrun judgment. Sweyn Godwinson was the eldest son, the heir to his father's political legacy, and by most accounts, a genuinely reckless man who seemed to go out of his way to destroy everything the family had built. He kidnapped an abbess, not metaphorically. He literally abducted the abbess of Leominster and kept her against her will before being forced to return her by the outrage of the church and the nobility. He was banished for this and fled to Flanders. He came back. He was pardoned. He killed his cousin in a brawl over a disputed earldom. He was banished again. He came back again. He was pardoned again. He went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, probably as penance for the murder. He died on the way home. Every time Sweyn burned a bridge, Harold's position improved. Every time his older brother disgraced the family, their father's eyes turned more firmly toward his second son. By the late 1040s, it was clear to everyone, including Harold, that he was the heir to the Godwin legacy, not just by default, but because he had earned it. In around 1045, Harold was given the earldom of East Anglia, a vast territory covering the eastern coast of England. He was approximately 23 years old. He was now one of the most powerful lords in the country. And it was in East Anglia that Harold Godwinson began to build the life that would eventually take him to a royal crown. The East Anglia of Harold's early career was a complex political landscape. It was a region with deep Scandinavian roots, the old Danelaw heartland, and it required a lord who could speak both worlds, who understood both the English traditions and the Danish ones. Harold was perfectly positioned for this. Half Anglo-Saxon through his father's line, half Danish through his mother's, fluent in the cultural codes of both worlds, he settled into the earldom with something that looks very much like natural authority. He also, around this time, fell in love. or something that looked enough like love to last 20 years and produce 5 children. Her name was Edith. She was known, with the understated elegance of the age, as Edith Swanneck, a reference, presumably, to some quality of her bearing or her beauty that struck people as worth preserving in a name. Her background was significant. She came from one of the most prominent Danish aristocratic families in England. Her father, For the Tall, had been a major figure in the Danelaw world of the early 11th century. Some chroniclers later claimed she was descended from Aethelred himself, which would have made her of the old royal line. Whether this is true or not, she was clearly a woman of considerable status. They never formally married. The relationship was what contemporaries called a Danish marriage, or more, Hanelage, a union recognized by custom but not by the church. This was not unusual in the England of the time. Canute himself had maintained a similar arrangement before his formal marriage. The church preferred formal unions, but it did not yet have the power to simply overrule aristocratic custom. What is clear is that the relationship was real and lasting. Edith gave Harold 5 children. She managed estates. She was, for at least 15 years, the woman at the center of his life. She would return at the very end of that life, in a moment so painfully intimate that even hostile Mormon sources could not quite dismiss it. But that is for later. Harold's decade in East Anglia was a masterclass in political construction. He built relationships with the great landowners of the region. He cultivated the church, especially the powerful abbeys of Ely and Peterborough, whose abbots would become his allies, and in one case, his soldier. He patronized arts and manuscript production, filling libraries with beautifully illustrated texts. And above all, he poured his resources and his devotion into a single religious institution that would become the heart of his public identity: Waltham Holy Cross Abbey in Essex.
Harold did not simply donate money to Waltham. He rebuilt it. He commissioned a new stone church. He organized the creation of a great stone cross, the kind of life-sized devotional sculpture that had deep roots in the Anglo-Scandinavian religious world. He gifted the abbey with relics, including, the records say, a piece of St. Peter's chain and a fragment of his beard. Whether those particular relics were genuine is perhaps a question best left to the realm of faith. What is undeniable is that Harold's investment in Waltham was substantial, sustained, and deeply personal. The abbey was not just a political symbol or a religious obligation. It was the place where he chose to put down roots in a way that transcended politics. It was, in a sense, his spiritual home. And it is where, according to the most persuasive traditions, they eventually brought his body after the catastrophe of 1066. While Harold was building his power base in the east, his father Godwin was approaching the peak of his influence, and simultaneously approaching a crisis that would briefly destroy everything. The crisis began with an archbishop. Robert of Jumièges was a Norman. He had been Bishop of London since 1044 and was one of Edward's most trusted advisors, imported directly from the Norman world the king had grown up in. In 1051, Edward appointed him as Archbishop of Canterbury, the most powerful church position in all of England. Godwin was furious. He had backed his own candidate for the position, a man with local roots and local loyalties, and had lost. Worse, Robert was actively hostile to the entire Godwin family, arguing loudly and publicly that they had accumulated too much power and needed to be brought to heel. The confrontation that followed was almost comic in its sudden violence. Eustace, Count of Boulogne, a French lord married to Edward's sister, visited England and got into a brawl with townspeople near Dover. Edward demanded Godwin punish the people of Dover for the incident. Godwin refused. the standoff escalated into something close to civil war. Edward summoned his great lords. Armies were raised. And then, in one of the most dramatic moments of the reign, the Godwin family blinked. They left. Godwin and most of his sons, Harold's brother Tostig among them, fled to Flanders. Harold himself, together with his brother Leofwine, went to Ireland. There, Harold made contact with Diarmat mac Mal Nambo, the King of Leinster, who provided him with ships and men and refuge while he waited for his opportunity. The House of Godwin had been exiled from England, and Harold's sister Edith, the Queen of England, was stripped of her position and placed in a convent by her own husband. It must have looked, in the autumn of 1051, like the end of everything. It was not even close to the end. Here is something worth holding in your mind as we move through Harold's story. Every time the Godwin family was cornered, every time it looked like they were finished, they came back. Not by luck, not by accident. They came back because they had spent decades building relationships and resources precisely so that they would have somewhere to go when things went wrong. Exile, in the world of 11th century Northern Europe, was not necessarily a death sentence. It was sometimes a strategic retreat. Harold spent the winter of 1051 to 1052 in Ireland, gathering ships and men. His father was doing the same in Flanders. And crucially, the political mood inside England was shifting. The Norman Archbishop Robert was deeply unpopular. Edward's dependence on foreign advisors had alienated many of the English nobility. And Harold and Godwin had spent years building the kind of loyalty that survived even catastrophic reversals. In the summer of 1052, father and son converged on England from two directions simultaneously, like the blades of scissors. Godwin came from the south, sailing up the Channel. Harold came from the west, sailing around the tip of Cornwall and into the Bristol Channel. They gathered support as they moved. By the time they reached London, they had an army and a fleet substantial enough that King Edward simply could not oppose them. Edward relented. All charges were dropped. The family was restored. Archbishop Robert, whose appointment had sparked the whole crisis, fled England and never returned. Harold's sister Edith was released from her convent and resumed her place as queen. The Godwin family was back, and they were stronger than before. Godwin himself did not live long to enjoy it. On April 15, 1053, just months after the triumphant return, he collapsed at dinner with the king. The sources are vague about what happened, but he was dead within days. Stroke, perhaps, or poisoning, if you believe the rumors that always swirled around the great medieval dynasties. The truth is we simply do not know. What we do know is that Harold Godwinson, at approximately 30 years of age, became Earl of Wessex, the most powerful noble in England. And from that moment forward, the throne was, in some sense, visible on the horizon. There is a strange quality to Harold's position in the 1050s that is worth dwelling on. He was not the king. He never pretended to be the king. He served Edward loyally, fought Edward's wars, administered Edward's kingdom, appeared at Edward's side on all occasions of state. By every formal measure, he was a subject. But the numbers told a different story. Harold's own landholdings, independent of his brother's territories, generated enormous wealth. Combined with his brothers Tostig in the north, Gurth in East Anglia, and Leofwine in the South Midlands, the Godwin family effectively controlled almost every major earldom in England. The only significant territory outside their direct grip was Mercia, held by the rival Earl Leofric. Edward the Confessor reigned. Harold Godwinson governed. The king himself was a genuinely fascinating figure.
Edward was pious in a way that seems to have been entirely sincere. He built Westminster Abbey from what appears to be genuine devotion, not political calculation, spending decades and vast resources on the project. He was reportedly gentle, possibly somewhat unworldly, and he had the misfortune of being childless. This last fact was the ticking clock at the center of everything. England needed an heir. Edward had none. His closest living male relatives were distant, disconnected, or complicated, and every year he failed to produce a successor, the great question grew louder. Who would be king after Edward? Harold had his own answer to that question, but in the 1050s he was still playing the long game, consolidating power, deepening loyalty, extending the reach of the Godwin family into every corner of English political life. He also, around 1057 or 1058, went on pilgrimage to Rome. This was not unusual for a great lord of the era. The 11th century was a period of intense religious feeling across Europe, and the pilgrimage to Rome was one of the great acts of public devotion that a powerful man could perform. Macbeth of Scotland had done it years earlier. Many other rulers and nobles made the journey. But Harold's trip to Rome appears to have been layered with political purpose. He traveled through Flanders, then through Germany, then south, and he may have been involved, along the way, in one of the most significant diplomatic missions of Edward's reign, the attempt to bring home a man known as Edward the Exile. Edward the Exile was the son of Edmund Ironside, who had briefly contested the English throne with Canute in 1016 before dying. As an infant, Edward had been sent out of England by the victorious Canute, too dangerous to keep at hand, too inconvenient to kill outright. He had spent decades in Hungary, and he was, by bloodline, the most legitimate heir to the English throne available. If Edward the Confessor was going to produce a successor without resorting to political compromise or foreign claimants, Edward the Exile was the answer. The problem was finding him, convincing him to come, and then managing the transition. Harold appears to have been the man tasked with the diplomatic groundwork. His travels through Germany in 1056 and 1057 were almost certainly connected to arranging the exile's return. Edward the Exile arrived in England in early 1057. Within days of his arrival, he was dead. The chroniclers noted the death with the kind of careful ambiguity that usually meant nobody wanted to say what they suspected. We do not know whether this was illness, accident, or something else. We know only that the most legitimate successor to the English throne had returned home after decades of exile and died before he could even meet the king. The succession crisis deepened, and Harold's calculation that he might position himself as the power behind Edward the Exile's throne dissolved. Now Harold began to think about a different kind of future. And here we come to the most contested moment in Harold Godwinson's entire life. The moment that, depending on who you believe, either explains everything that followed or explains nothing at all. In 1064, or possibly early 1065, Harold crossed the English Channel and visited the court of Duke William of Normandy. We know this happened. The Bayeux Tapestry, one of our key sources for the whole period, depicts it in detail. Norman chroniclers write about it. Even English sources acknowledge some kind of journey to Normandy. What we cannot agree on is why he went or what happened when he got there.
The Norman version of events is very clear. Harold went to Normandy on a mission from King Edward, whose purpose was to formally confirm to William that he had been chosen as Edward's heir to the English throne. Harold got into trouble during the journey, was captured briefly by a local lord and had to be rescued by William, and ultimately appeared before William at his court, There, Harold swore a solemn oath on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne. This oath, in the Norman telling, is everything. It is the foundation of William's moral case for the conquest of 1066. Harold swore. Harold broke his oath. Harold was, therefore, a perjurer and a usurper who deserved to be destroyed. But consider the problems with this account. Every single source that tells us about the oath in any detail was written by Norman chroniclers after the Norman Conquest of England. They had every reason in the world to tell a story that justified William's invasion. The Bayeux Tapestry itself was almost certainly commissioned by William's half-brother, Odo of Bayeux, a man with a deeply personal stake in the Norman Conquest narrative. We have no English version of events from the time. What we can say is this: Harold may well have gone to Normandy. He may well have made some kind of promise. But the nature of that promise, whether it was a voluntary commitment or something extracted from a man who was briefly a captive or a guest with very limited options, is impossible to recover with certainty. What we can say with confidence is that Harold, when the moment came, did not honor whatever he may have said on the Norman coast in 1064. And the question that has haunted his reputation ever since is whether he was a man who broke his word, or a man who was never in a position to keep it in the first place. By 1065, England was moving toward a crisis. Edward the Confessor's health was declining. The king who had reigned for more than 2 decades was aging visibly, eating less, praying more, drifting toward the death that would throw his kingdom into turmoil. And Harold's own position was about to be complicated by a crisis in his own family. His brother Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria since 1055. Northumbria was the great northern earldom, a vast, semi-independent territory that stretched from the Humber to the Scottish border and had its own traditions, its own culture, its own memory of Danish and Viking rule. It required careful handling. Tostig did not give it careful handling. The northern nobility had grown increasingly resentful of Tostig's rule, his tax demands, his high-handed methods, his apparent desire to extend his personal power at the expense of local lords. In late 1065, they rebelled. They rose against him, killed his household officers, and declared him outlawed. They installed a different earl and sent messengers south demanding Harold's support. Harold had a choice. He could back his brother, publicly, militarily, at the cost of renewed northern civil war at exactly the moment England could least afford it. Or he could abandon Tostig to his fate and consolidate his own position for what was clearly coming. He chose the latter. It was, politically, the correct decision. It was personally devastating. Tostig went into exile, furious, bitter, and nursing a grievance against his brother that would not cool with distance. That bitterness would become catastrophic the following year. Meanwhile, Westminster Abbey, Edward's great project, the monument to his reign, was being consecrated. December 28, 1065. The ceremony took place. The abbey was complete. And Edward the Confessor was not there. He was too ill to attend. Within days, it was clear he was dying. His great lords gathered around him. Confessions were heard. Prayers were said. And according to the accounts that have come down to us, all of them, of course, filtered through various forms of political interest. The dying king made a declaration about the succession. He chose Harold. Or he appeared to choose Harold. Or Harold and his allies successfully presented events in a way that made it look like he had chosen Harold. The sources are, as always, contested and partial. What is not contested is what happened next. Edward the Confessor died on January 5th, 1066, or possibly on the night of the 4th. The exact moment is uncertain. His funeral took place on January 6th at the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey. And on the same day, January 6th, 1066, the same day his brother-in-law and king was laid in the ground, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. Think about how fast that is. One day, Edward dies and Harold is crowned in the space of a single calendar day. Why the rush?
The honest answer is that Harold knew his claim was not unchallenged. He knew that William of Normandy had been arguing for years that Edward had promised him the throne. He may have known that Harald Hardrada of Norway, another claimant we will meet shortly, was watching events in England with interest. Every day that passed without a crowned king was a day in which alternatives could organize. Harold moved fast because he had to, because the crown, once available, was only safe to the man who put it on his head first. And so, on the Feast of Epiphany, 1066, Harold Godwinson became King Harold II of England, the first monarch ever to be crowned at Westminster Abbey, the beginning and end of the House of Godwin. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its understated way, noted that Harold met little quiet as long as he ruled the realm. It was perhaps the understatement of the century. The new king did not get long to settle into his role before the walls began to close. From the south, word came that William of Normandy was furious. He had been promised the throne, or so he claimed, loudly and persistently, and Harold's coronation was a direct betrayal of that promise. William began assembling an army and a fleet. He dispatched envoys to Rome, brilliantly framing the invasion he was planning as a righteous crusade to punish a perjurer. The Pope, to Harold's significant disadvantage, agreed. William's Norman army would march under a papal banner. From the north came a different problem, smaller at first, but growing with alarming speed. Tostig. Harold's exiled brother had not retired quietly to a comfortable exile on the continent. He had spent the winter of 1065 to 1066 building alliances, gathering ships, and recruiting mercenaries. In the spring of 1066, he launched a series of raids on the English coast, probing attacks, feeling for weakness, announcing his presence to anyone who might want to join him. Harold mobilized the southern fyrd, the local militia, and assembled his fleet. The raids were beaten back. Tostig moved north and was rebuffed there too. He retreated to Scotland, to the court of King Malcolm III, who gave him shelter but not an army. For a few weeks in the summer of 1066, England seemed to have stabilized. The threat from Tostig appeared contained. William was building his fleet across the Channel, but the autumn weather would delay him. Harold kept his army mobilized along the southern coast, watching the horizon, waiting. And then, from across the North Sea, came the sound that changed everything. His name was Harald Hardrada, Harold Sigurdsson, King of Norway. And he was, by almost universal agreement of the age, the most formidable warrior in the known world. His biography reads like a saga precisely because it was a saga. As a teenager, he had fled Norway after a disastrous battle and spent years as a mercenary in the Kievan Rus, the great Slavic Norse kingdom of what is now Ukraine and Russia. He traveled south from there and joined the Varangian Guard, the elite corps of Norse warriors who served the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. He fought across the Byzantine Empire, in Sicily, in Bulgaria, in Anatolia. He became wealthy. He became famous. Then he went home. He seized the Norwegian throne in the early 1040s after years of brutal warfare, and ruled it with the kind of iron ferocity that had kept him alive through 3 decades of professional violence.
He had spent years unsuccessfully trying to add Denmark to his Norwegian kingdom. By 1066, he was in his mid-50s, still formidably powerful, and looking for another prize. Tostig found him. The precise details of how Harold's exiled brother made contact with the Norwegian king are lost to us. What we know is that by late summer 1066, they had reached an agreement. Hardrada would invade England and claim the crown, based on a somewhat dubious argument that he was heir to Cnut's North Sea Empire through a succession of agreements, none of which were entirely clear. Tostig would provide local knowledge, English contacts, and additional men. In early September 1066, a Norwegian fleet of somewhere between 200 and 300 ships entered the River Humber, the north of England, which had just expelled Tostig the previous year, now faced both him and the most dangerous warrior in northern Europe. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, who had been Harold's allies in the Tostig dispute, marched out to meet them. At Gate Fulford, on September 20th, they were destroyed. The road to York was open.
News of Gate Fulford reached Harold somewhere in the south. He had disbanded his fleet by this point. Keeping an army mobilized through the summer had been expensive and exhausting, and with September well advanced, the storms that would make a channel crossing dangerous were approaching. He had let many of his men go home. He called them back. Fast. What happened over the next 5 days is one of the most astonishing military operations in medieval English history. Harold mobilized his forces in London and marched north. The distance from London to Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire is approximately 185 miles. Harold covered it in 4 days. This was not just a march, it was a race, pushing men and horses to their absolute limits, sustaining momentum through force of will and the desperation of the situation. On September 24th, Harold and his army arrived in Tadcaster, just south of York. They had covered the distance at a pace that nobody had anticipated, certainly not Hardrada. The Norwegian king and Tostig had, after their victory at Gate Fulford, moved their forces east to Stamford Bridge, a crossing point on the River Derwent, and were waiting there for the formal submission of the North. They had left much of their armor and equipment back on their ships. They were not expecting a battle. On September 25th, 1066, Harold arrived. The battle began with a moment that became legendary almost immediately. A single enormous Norwegian warrior, his identity lost to us, preserved only in the amber of the chronicles, stood on the bridge over the Derwent alone and held it against the entire English advance. He killed, the stories say, 40 men. He could not be defeated face to face. He was finally brought down by an English soldier who floated under the bridge in a barrel and stabbed upward through the planking. It may be legend. It probably is, at least partly. But legends do not grow around moments that are entirely empty of truth. Something extraordinary happened at that bridge. Something that passed into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. After the bridge was taken, the battle proper began. And Harold's army, despite the brutal march, despite the exhaustion, won a decisive and overwhelming victory. Harald Hardrada was killed, an arrow through the throat, the sources say, the same throat that had bellowed commands across 100 battlefields. Tostig died beside him, the rebellious brother fighting to the end under the banner of the man he had chosen over his own flesh and blood. The surviving Norwegians were so thoroughly defeated that they needed only 24 ships to carry the remnants of an invasion fleet that had arrived with hundreds. It was a spectacular victory, a great king's greatest moment. Harold had every right to feel vindicated, triumphant, unassailable. He had 3 days. On September 28th, 1066, 3 days after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy crossed the English Channel. He had been waiting and watching all summer. He had seen Harold's fleet dispersed and Harold's army sent home.
He had watched the news from the north, waiting for exactly the right moment when England's king would be as far away from the Channel coast as it was possible to be. He landed at Pevensey, on the Sussex coast, without opposition. News reached Harold at York on October 1st. He had been celebrating his victory, feasting, rewarding his men, processing the magnitude of what had just been achieved at Stamford Bridge. The celebration stopped immediately. What happened next is one of the most debated tactical decisions in all of medieval history. Harold turned south, gathered his forces, and marched back to London at almost the same brutal pace at which he had marched north. Was this a mistake? The argument for waiting is clear. Harold's army was exhausted. They had just fought a major battle. A period of rest and recuperation in the north, followed by a careful mobilization of the full English military resources, might have produced a better prepared force to face William in the south. The Norman army was already on English soil, yes, but William could be contained, managed, perhaps even outlasted, if Harold could build a large enough army in the south. The argument for speed is equally clear. William was already ravaging Sussex, burning villages, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock. Every day he remained unopposed was a day he consolidated his position and drained Harold's resources. Harold's people were dying. Harold was their king. Speed was not recklessness. It was responsibility. It was probably a combination of both impulses. A king who felt personally obligated to defend his people, and a commander who understood that a prolonged campaign favored the aggressor. Harold arrived in London around October 6th. He spent a few days gathering reinforcements and resupplying. His brothers Gurth and Leofwine urged caution. Gurth reportedly suggested letting him lead the English army south, while Harold remained in reserve. Harold refused. Whatever his reasons, pride, tactical judgment, or the feeling that a king who sent others to fight his battles was already half defeated, he led the march south himself.
On October 13th, Harold and his army arrived at the ridge near Hastings. They made camp. In the morning, it would end. Dawn, October 14th, 1066. Let us go back to where we began. Harold's men were arrayed along Sinlac Ridge. The position was well chosen. The ridge rose above the surrounding terrain, giving the defenders a significant natural advantage. The flanks were protected by marshy ground and streams. The line was perhaps half a mile long, formed by the Huscarls, Harold's professional, heavily armed household warriors, and behind them the Fyrd, the broader militia. The shield wall. England's oldest tactical formation. Locked shields, overlapping, presenting an almost unbroken wall of wood and iron to anything trying to come uphill. Below them, William's army began to form up. The Normans had cavalry. This was their decisive advantage. The heavily armed mounted knight who could deliver a charge with devastating kinetic force. But cavalry cannot charge uphill into a locked shield wall without suicidal results. William knew this. His plan was not a direct cavalry assault. It was attrition. Archers would weaken the line. Infantry would push and probe. Cavalry would wait for a gap. The battle began at around 9 in the morning. For hours, it looked like Harold might hold. The shield wall absorbed charge after charge. The Norman cavalry could not break it. At one point, a section of the Norman line fell back in what may have been genuine panic, or may have been a feigned retreat, and a portion of Harold's men broke formation and chased them down the hill. The Norman cavalry turned and destroyed them. The feigned retreat may or may not have been deliberate. Whether accident or genius, it worked. But the English line reformed. The core of it held. By afternoon, the battle had been going for hours. Both sides were exhausted. The English had been fighting from a stationary defensive position. The Normans had been mounting repeated uphill charges.
The losses on both sides were enormous. And then the afternoon light began to fade, and something changed. Norman archers were ordered to shoot in higher, steeper arcs, not straight at the shield wall, but upward, so that the arrows fell from above at an angle that could get over or under the rim of a shield. The English line began to suffer differently. Men who had held against direct assault found themselves pierced from angles they could not defend against. And Harold, King Harold, who had been fighting at the front of his men all day, as the best commanders of his age always did, was struck. Here is where history becomes legend, and legend becomes argument. The Bayeux Tapestry shows a figure near Harold's standard being struck by an arrow near the eye. The Latin caption reads, essentially, "Here King Harold is slain." Whether the arrow-struck figure is Harold, or whether it is a nearby warrior, has been debated for centuries. Later Norman chroniclers describe him being struck in the eye with an arrow and then cut down by knights. Some accounts describe multiple Norman horsemen breaking through and killing him with sword blows, making no mention of an arrow. We may never know exactly how Harold Godwinson died. What is not disputed is that he died on that ridge in the failing light of October 14th. And when he fell, the English army fell apart. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine had already been killed during the fighting. The three brothers lay together among the dead of Senlac Ridge as the Norman cavalry swept the broken English army from the field. The battle was over. England was lost. What happened to Harold's body is, in its own way, as contested as the battle itself. The first Norman accounts claimed Harold was buried on the cliff above the battlefield, a warrior's grave, said with a hint of mockery, to guard the coast he had failed to defend. William apparently refused to allow the family to take the body at first, though this account is disputed. But the tradition that has the most weight, the one that seems to carry the most emotional and historical truth, is this: Edith Swanneck came to Hastings, the woman Harold had loved for 20 years, the mother of his 5 children, the woman he had put aside in the political calculations of 1065 to marry Ealdgyth of Mercia and cement his alliance with the northern earls. She came to the battlefield after the fighting, and she walked among the dead until she found him. The chronicle tradition says she identified him by marks on his body that only she would know. Think about that for a moment. The most intimate testimony to the reality of a 20-year relationship, preserved in the middle of a political disaster, in the most painful way imaginable. His body was taken, most historians believe, to Waltham Holy Cross Abbey in Essex, the abbey he had rebuilt, that he had filled with manuscripts and relics, where he had placed his spiritual identity for the last 2 decades of his life. The monks received him and buried him. He was moved 3 times over the following century as the abbey was renovated and expanded, his burial site shifting, but always remaining within the institution that had been his home. A gravestone at Waltham was later inscribed with the simple Latin words, Hic eacit Harolder infelix. Here lies
But
Harold
wait,
the unlucky,
because the story
not the
has
usurper,
one more twist,
not the perjurer,
one more
not the
shadow
defeated,
at the edge of the frame.
the unlucky.
About 150 years after Hastings, a text appeared at Waltham Abbey. Written in Latin by an anonymous scribe, it told a story that was clearly old, a legend that had circulated in the abbey's community for generations. The Vita Haroldi, the life of Harold. And according to the Vita, Harold did not die at Hastings. He was wounded, grievously. But his supporters spirited him away from the battlefield before the Normans could confirm his death. He was taken to Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, and hidden there for 2 years while his wounds healed. Then, with the Normans in complete control of England, he made his escape. He traveled to the continent, Germany, maybe further. He spent years as a wandering pilgrim, in disguise, making his way through a world that did not know him anymore. Eventually, he returned to England. He lived as a hermit near Dover, then at Chester. At the very end of his life, to a confessor, he admitted who he was. "I was Harold, King of England." It is almost certainly not true. The sources are too late, too convenient, too filtered through legend to be trusted as history. But it is worth asking why the story existed at all. Why someone at Waltham, 150 years later, thought it worth preserving. Why the idea that Harold had survived, had walked away from the catastrophe, had lived in obscurity and penance and exile, was a story worth telling. Perhaps because the alternative, that everything ended on an October afternoon in 53 minutes of failing daylight, was simply too abrupt, too unsatisfying, too much of a waste of a remarkable life. What William of Normandy did to England after Hastings was, by the standards of medieval conquest, thorough and brutal. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, there was resistance. Edgar Atheling, the young heir of the old Wessex line, was declared king by a council of English lords. He submitted to William within weeks. The Norman army moved through England, burning, seizing, destroying. A campaign in the north, the Harrying of the North in 1069 to 1070, devastated entire regions of Yorkshire so completely that the Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, still listed much of the north as waste. Tens of thousands may have died. Within a generation, the entire English aristocracy had been replaced. Almost every significant landholding in England changed hands. The old Anglo-Saxon ealdormen and thanes were stripped of everything. Their estates went to Norman lords who had followed William across the Channel. The language changed. French became the language of the court, the law, the church. English was the language of peasants and servants. When English eventually re-emerged as a literary and official language, which would take 3 centuries, it was a different language. French words had flooded into it. Norman French had fused with Anglo-Saxon English to create something new. Harold's family fought on for a while. His sons, by Edith Swanneck, Godwin, Edmund, and Magnus, retreated to Bristol after Hastings and launched seaborne raids against the southwest coast of England in 1068 and 1069. They operated from Ireland under the patronage of Diarmait mac Mael Nambo, the King of Leinster, whose court Harold himself had visited in exile in 1051. The raids failed to generate the English uprising they hoped for. The raids stopped. The sons of Harold Godwinson eventually dispersed across Europe. Some accounts trace them to Scandinavia, others to the court of Geitha, Harold's mother, who herself fled to the Danish court. One tradition places Harold's descendants in Ruthenia, in the far east of Europe, intermarried into local nobility. The House of Godwin scattered to the winds. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1086, is a remarkable document, a comprehensive survey of English landholding that has no parallel anywhere else in medieval Europe. It is also a document with a political agenda. Harold Godwinson, who had been king for 9 months, is referred to throughout as Comes Haraldus, Count Harold. Not King Harold, not Harold II. The Norman compilers systematically stripped him of his royal title, as if the deletion of a Latin word could erase 9 months of history. The sheer volume of entries about his former landholdings made the erasure somewhat absurd. You cannot pretend a man never existed when every 3rd entry in your land survey describes property he used to own. But the intent was clear. In the official Norman history of England, Harold Godwinson had never been king. He had been a count who had overreached. William had simply corrected an error. This is what defeat looks like when it is thorough. Not just the loss of a battle, but the loss of the right to narrate your own story. 8 centuries after the Battle of Hastings,
A Victorian nobleman named Alfred Lord Tennyson sat down and wrote a play about Harold Godwinson. It was 1876. England was at the height of its empire, and Tennyson, the poet laureate who had written about the charge of the Light Brigade and the grief of a nation, wrote about Harold not as a usurper or a failed upstart, but as a tragic hero. A man whose qualities were undeniable, whose fate was unjust, whose story deserved better than the version the Normans had handed down. He was not alone. Edward Bulwer Lytton had written a novel about Harold in 1848. E.A. Freeman, the great Victorian historian, devoted multiple volumes to the Norman Conquest and was pointedly sympathetic to the last Anglo-Saxon king. Something in the Victorian imagination reached backward across 8 centuries and recognized itself in Harold Godwinson. The underdog, the native hero, the man who fought for his own country against a foreign invader and lost not because he was wrong, but because fortune was cruel and timing was catastrophic. But let us ask the question seriously. The question that haunts anyone who spends time with Harold's story. What if he had won? What if Harold had defeated William at Hastings the way he had defeated Hardrada at Stamford Bridge 3 weeks earlier? What if the shield wall had held until dark? What if William had fallen on that hill instead of Harold? The answers are necessarily speculative, but they are not empty. An England ruled by Harold Godwinson would have remained an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Its language would have developed differently. No Norman French flooding into the vocabulary, no Plantagenet dynasty, no Magna Carta in its particular form, no particular path to the constitutional monarchy that England eventually became. The course of European history would have shifted. The English-speaking world, which by the 19th century included most of North America, large portions of Africa, India, Australia, exists in the form it does because a particular set of linguistic and cultural norms were exported from an England that was Norman in its leadership, French in its court language, and increasingly complex in its cultural identity. An Anglo-Saxon England would have exported different norms, a different English, a different law. William's conquest, paradoxically, made the English-speaking world what it is. The English Harold would have produced a different world, none of which diminishes the tragedy of Harold's particular story. Here is what we can say about Harold Godwinson, shorn of the Norman propaganda and the Victorian Romanticism both. He was the product of the most powerful noble family in Anglo-Saxon England, and he served that inheritance faithfully and skillfully for 3 decades. He was a better administrator than the king he served. He was a better soldier than almost anyone he faced. He rebuilt a church out of genuine devotion and patronized the arts and learning in a way that suggests a man of real intellectual appetite. He maintained a relationship with a woman for 20 years with evident depth and care. He made political calculations that sometimes required hard choices. The abandonment of his brother Tostig, the setting aside of Edith Swan-Neck. These choices were not without cost, personal and political, but they were the choices of a man who understood power and bore its weight without pretending it was light.
When the crisis of 1066 came, not one invasion, but 2, delivered simultaneously from opposite directions, Harold responded with energy, courage, and tactical brilliance. He marched north and destroyed the most feared warrior in the known world inside 3 weeks of being informed of the invasion. He turned south and faced a second army without complaint, without delay, and without the luxury of rest. He did not, in the end, survive it. But was he the legitimate king of England? The honest answer is, more legitimate than the alternative. Edward the Confessor's deathbed declaration, whatever form it took, was the recognized mechanism by which English kingship was conferred. The Witan, the Council of Great Lords, confirmed Harold's succession. He was crowned by the Archbishop of York in the most sacred space in England. William's claim rested on a promise allegedly made years earlier by a childless king, confirmed, if it was confirmed at all,
by an oath extracted from a man who may have been in no position to refuse. The Norman sources are not objective testimony. They are propaganda, brilliant and effective propaganda, but propaganda nonetheless. Harold was king. For 9 months he was king, and in those 9 months he did what a king was supposed to do. He defended his kingdom against foreign invasion. He did it twice. He won once, he lost once. History is decided not by justice, but by outcomes. The outcome was Hastings. There is a gravestone at Waltham, or there was. Hic iacet Haraldr in Felix. Here lies Harold the unlucky, not the wicked, not the usurper, not the traitor, the unlucky. And perhaps that is, after everything, the most honest verdict anyone can offer about the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. A man born into remarkable circumstance, equipped with remarkable ability, tested by remarkable adversity, and undone, in the end, by the collision of 2 separate catastrophes in the space of 3 weeks. Harald Hardrada would not have come if Tostig had not been banished. Tostig would not have been banished if the North had not rebelled. The North would not have rebelled if Harold had not needed its support. Every domino traces back to every other domino. History rarely produces a single culprit. What it does produce, now and then, is a figure who stands at the intersection of every force pulling at once, and holds, as long as a human being can hold. Harold held for 9 months, and then he fell. And England has never been the same since.